Some of the hardest roads I've ever taken didn't look dangerous at first. Same goes for decisions, and sometimes even momentum. In this story, I'm going to tell you about a road I should have never driven, a version of myself that should have known better, and a lesson I only learned the hard way, about survival, focus, and why the worst conditions in life might just be where you find your grip. So grab your coffee, settle in, and listen close. Because this one's not just about driving through snow. It's about life, business, and what you discover when you stop sliding and finally start moving forward with purpose. Some mistakes don't look like mistakes until you're halfway through a frozen mountain pass with no chains, no heater, and no idea what you're doing. That's how I used to live. Full speed, no brakes, and just enough confidence to mistake recklessness for boldness. I was young, greedy maybe, restless for sure. The kind of restless that doesn't come from hunger, but from ego. And like most dangerous roads, it started with a girl. She didn't break my heart. I didn't even really have it figured out enough to have it broken. But she left, and I followed, right into the coldest, dumbest decision I've ever made. It was winter, harsh. The kind of cold that doesn't just bite, it buries. I was in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, a place I had no roots in, no business being in, and no plan for. She went to a Bible college there. I followed her like a stray dog chasing a scent. By the time I got there, she was already with someone else. And I stayed. Not for faith, not for school, for pride. Because even back then, I was already learning the first brutal rule of investing. You don't leave just because the chart looks bad. You wait for confirmation. And I waited for something to make sense, but nothing did. And when the semester ended, I found myself alone on that snow-covered campus, 2,500 miles from home. Home was Alaska, and between me and Alaska was the kind of terrain most men don't even fly over in winter. But I had a truck, an '85 Chevy S10, two-wheel drive, no snow tires, no heater fan, no chains, nothing but a full tank, a stubborn will, and the delusion that motion equals progress. So I packed my bags, zipped up my parka, and hit the road. I remember the first hour of that drive like a photograph burned into my brain. Snowbanks taller than my windows, wind shrieking like it was angry at me personally, and silence inside the cab. No music, just the hum of the engine and my own thoughts growing louder with every mile. There's something about long drives in dangerous conditions that feels familiar to anyone who's ever risked too much in the markets. You convince yourself you're in control until the curve comes. It was nightfall when I hit that mountain pass. No signs, no lights, no tire tracks. Just the road, the dark, and the kind of chill that makes your bones ache before the cold even touches your skin. I should have pulled over, but pulling over felt like failure. So I pressed on. And just past the crest of a hill, the road curved left. My wheels didn't. I slid, silently, smoothly, right off the road and into a drift deep enough to swallow the hood. The truck didn't crash. It just disappeared into snow. I sat there, engine ticking, windshield frosting from the inside, and I realized this is how people die. Not dramatically, not with music swelling in the background, but quietly, because they confused momentum with meaning. I stepped out. Cowboy boots, no traction. Each step was a question. What the hell am I doing here? Why didn't I fly? Why didn't I wait? Why didn't I plan? And if you've ever launched a business too early, bought too heavy into a market too shallow, trusted someone you barely knew with money you couldn't afford to lose, then you've asked the same questions. I started climbing back up that hill, boots slipping, breath burning. I wasn't thinking of stocks or charts or profits. I was thinking, get out, alive. At the top of that pass, there was a light. A single cabin, warm yellow in a world of blue shadows. I knocked. A man answered. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. And in a way, he had. Because the person I was when I left that road wasn't the same one knocking on his door. He didn't ask questions. He just opened the door and pulled me in. What he told me over that fire changed everything. And it wasn't what you'd expect. He didn't speak at first, just handed me a towel, pointed to the wood stove and motioned for me to sit. I was soaked, not just with snow, but with regret. My fingers were numb, and so was my thinking. That's what fear does. It shuts off the noise and makes you feel every decision you've ever made. The old man moved quietly, deliberately, like someone who didn't waste motion anymore. He reminded me of an investor I used to know, back when I was still climbing the ranks, who once told me, never rush into a trade, but when you do, never hesitate on the exit. The man handed me a plate of something hot and heavy. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't care. I ate like I hadn't eaten in days. Because I hadn't. Not really. As I thawed out, he finally spoke. "You're lucky," he said, not looking at me. "Most don't make it up here in boots like that." He meant it literally. But I heard more than that. I heard, most don't make it through life in the condition you're in. I wanted to defend myself, to explain, to prove I wasn't stupid, just young. But even I didn't believe that anymore. I had risked everything for nothing. No plan, no backup, no understanding of the environment I was entering. Just a sense of invincibility and a fear of standing still. That was the moment I realized something important about myself. I didn't just fear failure. I feared stillness. Stillness meant reflection. Reflection meant facing what I didn't want to admit. I had built a life on movement, not direction. In business, that looks like chasing trends, jumping sectors, trading because the screen is on, not because the fundamentals are solid. In life, it looks like jumping relationships, skipping conversations, switching cities, chasing validation. In that cabin, I was stripped of all the distractions. No signal, no market data, no social circle to perform for. Just me, the old man, and the sound of fire eating through wood. He told me his name. I forgot it. What I remembered was the way he spoke, with silence before every sentence, like he was testing each word in his mind before releasing it. At one point, I asked him why he lived so far out here. He shrugged. "Too many people don't listen anymore. Out here, you hear everything." That line stayed with me, because in markets, in marriage, in your own soul, listening is the one skill no one teaches you. We chase noise, but we grow in the silence. That night, I didn't sleep. Not really. I kept seeing the snow swallow my truck. I kept hearing the steering wheel creak as I forced it to turn. And I kept asking myself, how many times have I driven into situations I had no business being in? Too many, because I was rewarded for it. See, when you win big off a dumb move, your brain logs that as strategy. But it's not. It's luck. And luck, when mistaken for skill, becomes poison. The next morning, the man had the truck ready. Diesel, 4-wheel drive, engine plugged in all night. He said we'd better go before the temperature dropped again. We got in, drove down the mountain, and winched my S10 out of the snow like pulling a toy from a sandbox. It started on the first try, and I hated that, because it meant I could keep going, and I hadn't learned enough yet to deserve a second chance. But I took it anyway, because sometimes life gives you mercy when it should have given you consequences. Back on the road, I drove to Whitehorse, still in shock, still processing. It was 25 below zero. And inside my truck, everything was breaking down. Heater, fan, steering. It didn't matter. I had just enough momentum to keep moving. But momentum is a liar. It tells you you're making progress, when all you're doing is surviving. I parked at a friend of my father's and collapsed into a borrowed bed. My last thought before falling asleep wasn't about the truck or the cold or the road ahead. It was this. What else in my life have I survived by accident? and mistaken that for wisdom. I wasn't driving home anymore. I was driving toward the man I was supposed to become. I just didn't know it yet, and the worst of the road was still ahead. I woke up before the sun. Not because I was rested, because I was restless. There's a kind of sleep that doesn't restore you. It just holds you down. And when I woke that morning in Whitehorse 25 below zero, I felt like I'd been held underwater all night. Still, I got up. Not because it was wise, but because it was all I knew how to do. Keep moving. I stepped outside. My truck sat there like a stubborn old friend, loyal but worn down. I turned the key. It fired up, but it wasn't right. The engine knocked so hard it sounded like someone was beating it with a hammer. Bam, bam, bam. Each strike was a heartbeat of consequence. And still, I let it run. Because if I shut it off, it might not start again. And isn't that just like life? You push forward not because it's ideal, but because stopping feels like the end. The heater fan had gone out. The defroster didn't work. So I drove, one gloved hand on the wheel, the other scraping frost from the inside of the windshield, eyes squinting through slivers of visibility. The air inside was colder than a freezer, and with every mile the steering stiffened, frozen rack and pinion. I had to use both hands to turn. Each curve became a negotiation between strength and faith. And that's when I realized this wasn't a road anymore. This was a metaphor. This was every investment I made out of desperation. Every relationship I held onto past its worth. Every version of me that was breaking down, but I kept driving anyway. I reached Beaver Creek, near the Canadian-Alaskan border. A handful of trucks were parked outside the station. I stepped in. Boots frozen, fingers numb, soul raw. Two truckers looked up. One nodded. I asked them what the temperature was. One of them said, "Thermometer bottomed out this morning. We don't know. It's below -50. I asked about the road ahead. He laughed. "Don't worry, it's so cold the ice crystallized. Got more grip now than in the summer. You won't slide off even if you try." And I stood there, silent, processing. That was it. The worse the conditions became, the more traction I had. Think about that. At 10 below, the road was dangerous, slick, unpredictable. At 50 below, it was solid, crystallized into something that held me steady. The moment most people would call unlivable was the moment I could finally drive. And isn't that the truth in business, in life? When markets are unpredictable, when clients are flaky, when the noise is overwhelming, we slip, we overcorrect, we panic. But when everything crashes, when the economy tanks, when the relationship ends, when your career flatlines, that's when you finally stop sliding. Because there's nowhere left to go. You either grip the wheel and keep going, or you die in the snow. I walked back to my truck, didn't turn it off, didn't hesitate, just got in and hit 70 miles per hour. The road was mine, not because it was safe, but because it was honest. There was no illusion anymore, no warmth, no comfort, no lies, just me, the machine. And the raw truth that sometimes the worst conditions are the ones that finally hold you accountable. The rest of the drive blurred into muscle memory, frostbite on my knuckles, cough in my chest, tears I didn't understand. I pulled into my parents' driveway that night around 10:30. They rushed out, hugged me like I was a ghost. And maybe I was, because the man who left Wisconsin was gone. I didn't tell them what happened. Not really. I just said, I made it. But later that night, alone on the porch, I looked up at the stars, felt the sting in my fingers, and whispered the truth out loud. I should be dead, but I wasn't. And now, I had a story. Not of glory, but of clarity. Years passed. I made money. I lost it. I made more. And I lost a few parts of myself along the way, too. But I never forgot that road, that frozen curve, that moment in the dark when my wheels refused to follow my hands. It wasn't just a near-death experience. It was a mirror. A mirror that showed me what kind of man I really was, and what kind I wanted to become. Sometimes I think back to that cabin, to the quiet way the old man moved, to the way he handed me food without asking questions. There was something sacred about his silence, something that said, "You've already been judged. Now, just be." I didn't understand it back then, but I do now. Because in the business world, everyone's loud. Everyone's selling, pitching, proving. Everyone wants to look like they've never driven off the road. But me? I've slid, I've spun, I've buried the engine in the snow and begged for a second chance. And that's why I trust myself now. Not because I'm flawless, but because I've seen who I am when everything breaks. You learn more from the frost on your windshield than from the profits in your ledger. You learn more from a quiet cabin in the woods than from any boardroom. I've had partners. I've had empires. I've had losses that almost made me, and I've watched others fall. People who never slid before, but didn't know what to do when they finally did. They had no traction, because they had never been forced to find it. That's the thing about hitting bottom. It's not the end. It's the only place where you can finally stop sliding. And once you stop sliding, you can finally drive. Real drive. Not noise, not ego, not panic, but forward motion with purpose. So now I sit here, on this beach. Salt in the air, fire pit cooling, coffee cup half full. The wind off the ocean feels like a whisper compared to that northern storm. But it carries the same lesson. You don't know what you're made of until you're frozen, alone, and still willing to move. And if you find yourself there now, if the relationship has collapsed, if the portfolio is red, if the road ahead is invisible through the fog, good. Because this might be the only time in your life you stop sliding. This might be where the traction begins. So drive. Drive because you've got nothing left to lose. Drive because you're finally honest with yourself. Drive because quitting is louder than failure and far more permanent. And one day, you'll sit where I sit, look back on that impossible road, and you'll realize that wasn't where I nearly died. That was where I came alive. Some mistakes don't look like mistakes until you're halfway through a frozen mountain pass. But that's where I found my grip, and I've been moving forward ever since. Thanks for sticking around. Most people don't. They want the punchline without the bruises. But if you made it this far, maybe you're one of the few who knows. The lesson only lands after the story's done. I don't need applause. I've already had more than I deserved. But if something in this story helped you find your own traction, then it was worth telling. So, take care of yourself. And if the road gets rough, don't panic, don't quit. Just keep the engine warm and drive. We'll talk again soon.